This episode is brought to you by Top Notch Cattle Company, raising high-quality registered red and gray Brahman cattle. Contact Baxter Whitworth at 903-649-9155 or at bbwtopnotchcattle@gmail.com.
If I only breed for feed efficiency alone, I'm going to end up with cattle with really small organs that might not be able to handle the environment, have the disease resistance, and maybe be able to handle the extra days on feed. And they might not be able to eat enough either.
Welcome to the Cattle Innovation Station podcast,
bringing you the innovative new ways of the cattle industry.
We're your hosts, Baxter Whitworth and Paul Hayes. Together, we're going to be interviewing leaders within the cattle industry.
Here on this podcast, our focus is honoring God and innovating the cattle industry. Get ready to listen, learn, and laugh as we help innovate the cattle industry.
Let's get innovating. If you truly want your livestock to perform at their best, make sure to contact Vance Aaron, the owner and operator of AFL Livestock Solutions. Vance specializes in magna-wave treatments that use pulsed electromagnetic fields, or PEMF, to relieve pain, swelling, and inflammation, caused to help your livestock feel their best. In addition to livestock, Vance can also help you feel better. His treatment works great on sore muscles and joints, along with other mobility issues. His treatments are FDA approved to treat migraines. Aaron Family Livestock Solutions has helped many exhibitors make it to the backdrop with their proven magna-wave treatments. Don't miss your next backdrop picture. Give Vance a call at 903-720-3184. Again, that's 903-720-3184. Or find them on Facebook at AFL Livestock Solutions. It's time for another episode of the Cattle Innovation Station podcast, where we keep you current on beef cattle industry events, help you innovate your herd to turn a profit, and help innovate the beef cattle industry so we can feed more people on less land. I'm your host, Baxter Whitworth, and your guest today is Dr. Jon DeClerck. He was our guest last episode, and we'll go ahead and introduce him to you again. He's the Executive Vice President for the American Semantall Association, and with that, he runs the International Genetic Solutions, which is the largest database for herd evaluations and genetic evaluations in the country, with 25 breed associations and 23 million head of cattle. So that's a pretty big deal. Dr. DeClerck, how are you tonight?
Doing great, Baxter. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Well, we left off talking about how to improve feed efficiency in your herd. We've talked about breeding cattle to be more feed efficient, and we've talked about kind of how the environment plays a role in feed efficiency. But from a nutritional management standpoint, how can we make sure that we're feeding our cattle what's going to help them gain the most or reach their maintenance level, depending on what your goal is, while finding the option that costs us the least?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me, Baxter, is that a lot of this comes down to just kind of doing the math. Lots of times our instinct is I need to go buy a bag of cubes or a protein tub or just a bag of feed. And most people kind of think they're all the same, right? So I think that we all kind of understand that, if I sit down and have a pound of food tonight, it's a pound of salad or a pound of ice cream. There's going to be a pretty big difference in my gut, right? And how much I'm going to gain. And I think sometimes as ranchers, we've got this just kind of mentality of, they just need some cubes or they need some feed. Well, not all feed's created equal, right? So I think that when I try to, when I was working as a consultant and would work with ranches, we try to maybe price on a pound of per energy, like this is how much does this cost to buy per pound of TDN, total digestible nutrients, like that'd be a pound of energy. Or how much does it cost me to buy a pound of protein? And so there's some calculations that go on there. I know that, there's things like wet distillers grains and silage that's, 60, 70% moisture. So naturally there's not as much nutrients in there because if you're buying a lot more water. So I need to adjust it to a dry matter basis to make sure I'm doing a good job there. And even if I'm comparing feeds from a co-op, I still can go through and figure out what my, how much a pound of energy is taken or how much a pound of protein. And that's where we can make a little bit more apples to apples comparison. I'd say the same thing on hay. It's amazing to me how few ranchers actually weigh the hay that they buy or they don't test it. They'll, you'd never go to a feed store and buy a bag of feed and it could weigh 30 pounds. It could weigh 90 pounds and you wouldn't even check it. Right. But we all kind of do the same thing. Well, I bought a round bale from my neighbor, a big round bale. Well, what's that weigh? Is it 900 pounds? Is it 1,400 pounds? We need to weigh that hay and we need to test it too. Our eyes are not as savvy as sometimes at selecting hay. I used to do some producer meetings, and one of my favorite things to do is we'd bring in 5 or 6 bales of hay, and I would test the hay before we got there, and I'd ask the ranchers to kind of give me an estimate of how they thought the hay was going to test. And some of them would do okay, but most of the time they were, there's several of them that would really trick you. So I think actually testing the hay that you got to make sure that we can figure out what we're providing those cows. And then when we're buying feed, making a comparison on a unit of energy or a unit of protein basis so we can get back to, okay, my cow needs X. How much of that, am I going to provide? If this cow needs 15 pounds of total digestible nutrients a day and I'm feeding 5 pounds of this supplement, well, how many of those pounds am I actually getting to? So sometimes it takes a little math, a little bit of computation, but that's the best way usually to kind of control feed efficiency, is to buy feeds that are calorically dense and going to fit your environment, right? I don't want to go just sell or feed cracked corn 20 pounds that day and give those cows a gut ache either. So finding the right supplement is paramount.
That makes sense. And I want to go back to something I meant to start off this episode with that you talked about in the last episode. And you talked about how we're breeding cattle and they're becoming more feed efficient, but their organs aren't catching up with that, and it's causing failure, heart failure, and respiratory disease. And so I just want to ask: is there a way that producers can breed for cattle that have larger organs, or is that not really something that's possible to do?
Yep. It's a little tough, Baxter, and I think that's one thing that we got to wait for kind of science to probably catch up with that, to give us some of those tools. As you can imagine, most seed stock producers can turn in weaning weights and yearling weights. When we start getting to some of these carcass traits, it's kind of hard. Like most of those producers that are making EPDs, they're not going to be able to measure some of those things. So perhaps we'll have some technology come along here. But I think that the true, maybe the part of that story to take in is that if I only breed for feed efficiency alone, I'm going to end up with cattle with really small organs that might not be able to handle the environment and have the disease resistance and maybe be able to handle the extra days on feed. And they might not be able to eat enough either, right? As cows, they might eat less grass than any of the other cows out there, and they might actually be more efficient at that grass conversion than anybody. But if they can't eat enough grass to put on a little extra body condition for the times of the year where they're lactating, to create that kind of reserves, they're probably still not going to breed back. And for me as a consultant, when I'd work at feed yards, it was the same thing. I could have a set of cattle that were very feed efficient, kind of bigger framed, heavy muscled cattle, really tubular in their rib design. And those cattle might pencil out to be 5.8 to 1 feed efficiency. But when I would run my break evens, we'd still lose money on them because if they couldn't eat enough feed to finish out in a timely manner, like the days on feed, we'd have to pay yardage, a fee every day to be in that yard. That would kind of like paying rent for the pen. The rent would kind of get to us, and we'd still wouldn't be profitable. So at this time, there's probably not a tool to try to select for animals with larger organs. There are EPDs that are starting to be developed on bovine congestive heart failure and bovine respiratory disease. And by selecting for those, you would probably inherently be using, getting animals with larger organs or more robust innate immune systems. Um, but there's just not a lot of that data out there. There's not a lot of people going into packing plants and looking at heart scores and lung scores. Simplot has done a really good job of that. But it's still kind of in the novel stages.
That makes sense. Are you looking for high quality hay that is priced well? Then make sure to visit Threadgill Hay Company. They have fertilized horse jigs and Tifton 85. They carry square bales and round bales. Their square bales are $8 a bale, and their 4x6 round bales are $50 per roll. That's a nice price and good quality. They're located outside of Mount Enterprise, Texas, and they will gladly give you more details when you contact them. Speaking of contacting them, you can reach out by texting Sawyer Pool at 903-646-4741 or Ronald Threadgill at 903-235-2011.
Have you been looking for Brahman cattle with a good genetic background? Contact 79 Cattle Company, selling reliable Brahman replacement heifers, Brahman show prospects, and Brahman bulls. Contact Taylor Tate at 210-241-4511. Again, that's 210-241-4511. Or contact Mallory Tate at 210-861-0155, 210-861-0155.
All right, well, that's great. It's always good to learn about new research happening in the beef industry, especially when it pertains to feed efficiency. But I think to move on, we've kind of had a pretty volatile market in the cattle industry recently. Some things that even words have caused ups and downs in the cattle market, and just new things. And we've expected, the cattle market to just kind of keep on going up, and some things have changed. And so, with Trump talking about the importing beef from Argentina, first of all, can you just kind of explain how we already do import ground beef from other nations, and how our importing beef from Argentina would affect our beef supply, how it currently is?
Right. So that's a really good question. I hear a lot of people asking about imports and exports, and particularly, your first instinct is like, why do we need to be bringing in beef from other countries? We create the best beef supply here in the United States, and we certainly do. But as you kind of alluded to earlier, Baxter, 53% of what American consumers eat is ground beef. We have a really high hamburger demand, and we don't have enough cull cows here in the United States to be able to generate that hamburger demand. And particularly when we look at ground beef that's going to come off young animals, a lot of that is about 50% fat, 50% lean. Well, nobody wants to go to the grocery store and buy a 50% fat hamburger, right? And so what we'll do is we'll take ground cull cows, lots of times from South America, that's going to be 90-95% lean, mix it together with some of that young trim to create a product that's going to be more favorable for the American consumer. So the benefit of actually bringing in lean ground trim from South America is that it enables us to export to overseas, where we've got a lot of great partners in the Pacific Rim, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, that will buy our beef at a very high value product. In fact, most of the time, the estimates are that the export market adds $500 to every single animal, because we're selling whole carcasses and steaks. And we're also selling a bunch of stuff we don't want to eat, like beef tongue and some different kind of things over here that maybe we don't really care to eat, that are going to be delicacies over there. And so if we did not export, or if we did not import all that lean ground trim from South America, we'd have to ground up ribeyes and roast here in the United States just to make the ground beef demand that we have. So on a normal year, we import and export about the same amount of beef. And even though we import and export about the same amount of beef, we generally have a $2 billion trade surplus, meaning what we sell is worth $2 billion more than what we're actually bringing in. Now, because we're at record low cow numbers the last couple of years, we're down to the smallest cow herd we've had since 1952. We have been importing more beef now to keep up with consumer demand, which isn't a bad thing. If we got beef prices so high, you might actually see some consumers switch off of beef into cheaper, to an additional, to an alternative protein source like maybe chicken or pork. And so we don't want those consumers to leave. So we have been importing quite a bit more beef than what we've been exporting. But still, when you look at the total dollars that are spent, um, even though we're kind of at a major deficit in terms of tonnage, um, we're pretty close to breaking even just when you look at the actual dollars that are being spent because of what we're selling is worth so much more money than what we're actually bringing in on a price per pound unit.
Right, and we've talked about it before on this podcast that America's niche is the high quality beef that we produce, and that's a great thing. But I want to ask you about something you said that Americans prefer lean ground beef. Has there been any studies to see how open people would be to maybe a little bit less lean ground beef that would um have the fattier ground beef that American cattle have?
Well, you can certainly go to the grocery store and there's different blends, right? There'll be 95% lean, 90, 80. They'll even go down to 73. Usually when you go down to the less lean, when you're buying more fat, it's usually a little cheaper, but it's pretty tough to find anything under, 73% lean, at a grocery store. So we do need to blend that together. The one thing I do see a lot of folks are a little worried about is the price of beef. You'll hear Baxter, a lot of people say that, man, we got beef prices are at an all time high. We've never had beef higher than what it is now. Well, if you look at it, that's just how inflation goes. It's not just beef that's higher than it's ever been. What about pickup trucks? They cost a lot more today than they did 20, 30 years ago, right? About everything costs more. So, yes, there's no doubt the price of beef is higher than it's ever been. But the statistic that I like to look at is how many minutes work does it take to buy 1 pound of fresh beef? And that is able to basically account for inflation. And what you'll see is that the average American has to work 14 minutes to buy 1 pound of beef. And it's been basically 14 minutes for the last decade. Over the last 10 years, if you take the average American making the average salary in the United States, they got to work 14 minutes to buy 1 pound of ground beef and or fresh beef, excuse me. So, that's a pretty good statistic. So when you hear people probably kind of start to fearmonger that boy beef costs all this money and we're not going to be able to afford it, luckily for us, the rise in beef prices have been very commensurate with the rise of income of the average United States citizen, and that's why we've got such a resilient demand. We got the highest consumer demand for beef we've had since 1988. We got the lowest cow herd we've had since the mid 50s. So as a consequence, we've got a really resilient demand. You talked a little bit about maybe some political headwinds that are causing some short-term dips in the cattle market. But if you look at the long-term fundamentals, we got resilient demand. We've got a high-quality product here. And the really exciting thing is going to be that the leverage index is shifting back to those of us on the cow calf side. Um, every now and again, people will ask me, they'll be like, well, if why are cow calf producers making so much more money today if it still takes about 14 minutes to buy 1 pound of beef? Like that, if that had been the same case 3 or 4 years ago, why wasn't I making as much money then? Well, at that time, the packers had more leverage because of during COVID, we backed up 1 million head of cattle when those packing plants shut down. And so we were harvesting cattle on nights and weekends, 60, 70 hours a week just to get through that backlog. Today, we can harvest all the cattle we need in the United States in about 32 hours a week. So most packers aren't even harvesting cattle on Fridays. So there's more packing capacity than what we have cattle. So those guys have to bid more aggressively. The packers, they sign contracts 6 months, years in advance, and so if they've got to fill a contract with HEB or Texas Roadhouse and they got to buy cattle at a loss to fill it, that's what they're going to do. So, every now and again, people just can't believe the Packers are actually, losing money. And if you look at it, I think Tyson Fresh Meats, you saw they just shut down a big packing plant the other day that harvesting about 5,000 head of cattle a day. I think their beef sector is forecasted. They're a publicly traded company. They're projecting to lose $426 million this year. That's an adjusted loss, and if it was an unadjusted loss, I think it'd be 1.1 billion. So, the difference is that obviously the Packers did very well during COVID when they had the leverage, when there was more cattle than harvest supply. But now that there's more shackle space than cattle, those of us in the cow-calf side are the ones that are making a little bit more money.
Wow, so there's a lot to unpack there. 2 points with that, really. First of all, how much of an impact do you think that plant closing down is going to make on the consumer or the producer? Do you think that's really going to matter to either side much?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily going to matter as much to the consumer. We'll still be able, Baxter right now, it's probably, as I mentioned earlier, we can harvest all the cattle we need in the United States in 32 hours a week right now. So it's probably not going to be a short term, isn't going to make as much of an issue. Maybe for Tyson, they're going to have more of their plants operating 5 days a week instead of 4 days a week. Where it could potentially become an issue is once the cow herd starts to build back up. I doubt we ever get back to 32 million beef cows. That's where we were in 2019. But we might get a little north of 30 million beef cows. We're a little south of 28 million now. So if we end up adding another 2.5 million cows to the balance books, to the books, and, then we got to harvest another 2 million head of cattle a year. That's probably where that toll is going to come due. What really hurt the cattle industry from 2005 to 2015, we lost the ability to harvest about 7 million head of cattle in the United States. Most of the big packers shut down a plant, like Cargill shut down a plant there in Plainview. Pretty much all the big four shut down a harvest capacity plant there. So even going into COVID, we're already harvesting cattle on nights and weekends prior to, just to meet the demand, or to meet the cattle supply. And so then when we backed up 1 million head of cattle, then we were way, way, way behind. So I don't see it being a short-term issue now. Where I do see it be an issue is if there's not other harvest capacity that comes online, when the cow cycle turns and we start to get more cattle supply and inventory, we could be a little bit short on shackle space. Now, there's been a lot of different packing plants that have been proposed to be built over the last few years. It's extremely expensive to build a packing plant. I think most of the estimates are it's going to take about 200 to 250 million for every 1,000 head of cattle you can harvest a day. So, just to put that into perspective, that, that plant that Tyson just shut down, that was harvesting 5,000 head of cattle a day, you're looking at $1.2 billion to build a brand new plant like that, or a little over $1 billion. That's a lot of capital investment to get started. There are new plants that are, being proposed. Obviously, I've heard a lot about the one in Amarillo. Don't know if that one gets built or not. North Platte. There's some different facilities that are hopefully going to come online that as the cattle cycle starts to build back up, maybe we can address that shortfall. But that's where I think we'll see maybe an issue is when the cattle cycle turns.
Infinity Cattle Services, owned by Chris Shivers, is glad to be a sponsor of the Cattle Innovation Station podcast. Infinity Cattle Services, a unique, vision-driven, service-oriented company committed to developing successful revenue-producing cattle operations, is a full-service consulting and marketing firm specializing in Brahman and Brahman-influenced cattle. Contact them today to learn more about how they can assist you with locating cattle, cattle mating, sale management, marketing, communications, record keeping, data submission, and a wide array of other services. They can be reached at 713-202-1747. Again, that's 713-202-1747,
or at infinitycattleservices@gmail.com. That is infinitycattleservices@gmail.com. Visit their website at infinitycattle.com or check them out on Facebook and Instagram.
Well, and see, that's something that can affect us long term, like you said, and so we don't really know how it's going to work out until something like that happens again that happened a few years ago, where the demand shifted. Hopefully, not a pandemic, but where the demand shifts. But then I also want to go back to what you talked about a second ago with the time it takes to buy beef being relatively pretty close to the staying a steady line. And I think that's a great point. And a lot of people don't understand that. And another thing is relative to many luxuries that people will consistently spend money on, they're spending way more on those luxuries than they are on basic nutritional things like beef. And that's not to say that any of those things are bad. It's just to understand that beef prices aren't as out of control as you would think, and that it's, like you said, it's stayed the same over time.
Absolutely. There are a couple other items that have outpaced the average income in the United States, right? I think cumulative inflation since 2020 is about 26%. So producers or consumers are still being squeezed from other places, right? So sometimes we still need to be worried a little bit about beef prices. We don't want beef prices to continue to rise, and that's why if we didn't import any beef, we'd probably price ourselves out of the market. So we've been lucky that we've been able to kind of keep at the same rate of incline as what consumer salaries have been. But no doubt there are some other items that, because they've risen at a sharper rate, are still probably putting some pressure on consumers. But as you mentioned, Baxter, we're lucky that we've been able to hold pretty constant over the last decade.
Well, and with that, beef prices may have gone up with the inflation, but so has fertilizer and tractors and every feed and everything else that goes into raising cattle and processing also. And so it just, as the price of that goes up, our margins in 2021 after the pandemic were shrinking, and so it's nice to have a little bit of a breathing room now. Um but do you think that any changes from the political climate will impact the price of beef over the next couple of years, or do you think that the price of beef will continue to go along that 14-minute line, or go up or down, or how do you think that'll trend?
Yeah, I think the big jumps in the market in terms of the incline are probably done. It just, again, I'm not an economist, but I would sure say that I think that, we've had a really nice steady rise over time. And I think the prices are probably, maybe going to continue to climb, but just at a slower rate. And I think we're probably pretty close to the peak. I foresee the next 2 to 3 years to be very strong from a price standpoint. Now, I think what's important to keep in mind is that the aggregate, the long term, I think the next 2 3 years are going to be great. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be something that's said in the political arena that's not going to cause a short term price drop, right? That if there's some mentions of tariffs or other government policy or other exogenous shocks to the system, right? When Ukraine got invaded, the cattle market had a big dip a couple of years ago. I remember at short course, Japan raised their interest rates. And that caused the cattle market to go down. So there's other factors around the world that could cause maybe short term dips in the market, and it's frustrating if you're a beef producer and that happens to be the week that you sell your cattle because you kind of take in the shorts. But I still believe the next 2 to 3 years, for sure, we're probably going to still see very strong cattle prices, just based on supply and demand. We got great demand, and it takes a long time to repopulate the cow herd. That doesn't happen overnight. So I still feel pretty bullish on the cattle market for the next 2 to 3 years here. I think 2029 is probably when the market we'll start to see those replacement heifers come into production, and maybe that cow herd ramping back up, and we probably could see prices start to kind of ease down. Is what my best estimate would be.
Okay, well that makes sense. That's the year I graduate, so that'll be a good deal for me to sort out then.
EP Cattle Company. Owned by Eddie Wilson, EP Cattle Company is home of Sir Rouse Handshake. Rouse Handshake is a sound-structured, heavy-muscle bull that is really bold-ribbed. So it comes with no surprise that he is a Fort Worth and San Antonio Junior Show Division Champion and Rio Grande Valley Open Show Division Champion. He is a grandson of BRC Noble and JDH Shank Manso, and is also a great-grandson of Mr. H. Elijah Manso. You can contact Eddie Wilson or Nicole Wilson on Facebook at EP Cattle Company. So remember, if you're looking for some well-performing registered Brahman genetics, contact Eddie Wilson on Facebook.
I know you're not an economist, like you said, but I've heard you speak on these issues, and you're pretty knowledgeable on a wide array of subjects. So I do have one last question on the market topic, but do you think that the Department of Justice investigating the Packers and the Big Four Packers, do you think that'll have any effect? And how do you think that'll have any effect on the cattle industry at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll tell you that a lot of people get worried about the percentage of the market that the largest four packers control. If you look back at the statistics all the way back to the mid 1980s, the big four packers have controlled between like 79 and 83% of the market. And, we focus on it because it's our industry, right? But, how many people make pickup trucks? You got GM, you got Ford. It's not like there's 20 people that make pickup trucks, or it's not like there's 20 cell phone carriers either, right? You got Verizon, you got AT&T, you got just a handful. So in most of the industries that we look at, lots of times there's going to be 3 or 4 major players that control a big part of the industry. So, I think that sometimes producers will look at the Packers and kind of say, "Boy, it's all the Packers are colluding." I think most of the time it's just a shackle space. Like I said, if I could snap my fingers today and we could get the ability to harvest another 5 to 10 million head of cattle, and if they happen to all be owned by the big four Packers, the cattle market would be really resilient for when that turn comes back around. I think it's more shackle space and harvest capacity than it is necessarily packer concentration. Now, if the Justice Department finds some wrongdoing, then yeah, naturally those folks need to pay some fines, and nothing else. Maybe some investigations here and there keeps everybody honest. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. But I don't think that at least from the information that I've seen, I don't think that there's any smoking bullets there. I don't think there's any smoking guns that we've got just these guys did it for sure. I just think it's a general kind of ebbs and flows of the market. The Packers made a lot of money when there was more cattle than harvest capacity. They're losing a lot of money now that there's less cattle than harvest capacity, and that's kind of the natural ebbs and flows of the market, and has been over the last 20 to 30 years. What I would tell you, my goal is to build a resilient cattle market. We want to make sure that there's enough money in there for everybody. I want the feed yards to make money. I want the cow calf guys to make money. I want the stockers to make money. I want the packers to make money. I want everybody in the beef business to be profitable. We don't want to necessarily be winners and losers, because if we're going to build a resilient beef industry, we need people that we can partner with. And now, if maybe this investigation kind of keeps people from skirting the rules, that's great. But in the long run, that's, I think, what everybody's goal should be.
That's a really good point. This podcast primarily focuses on the cow calf guy, but we don't want anybody suffering or struggling. And so that's a really good point. And I've also haven't thought about what you said about most of the industries having a kind of a big 4 or 5 that control the market in most industries. And so that's another viewpoint I haven't thought about very much, and that's something good to bring up.
Yeah, for sure. And we, like I said, in the end, it's not good for us if the Packers are losing money because they're not going to be partners for us, right? We need somebody to harvest our cattle. And so we want them to play by the rules. And if they're not playing by the rules, then by all means, the Justice Department needs to figure that out. But in the end, like we want to make sure that everybody makes money so that we've got a beef business that we can pass on to the next generation, like yourself, Baxter, and you can pass on the generation after that. And we all need to be partners in this situation if we're going to thrive and continue to, live this lifestyle that we're all so fond of.
Right, and like we say at the beginning of the episode, we have to feed more people on less land, and so it's going to take all of us to do that. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode. We'll be back with another one. Make sure to share this episode with your friends and help them learn the knowledge you have also. Until next time, keep innovating the cattle industry. Signing off.
Have you been looking for a place to buy top quality AI sire semen or collect a bull of your own? Well, look no further than Elgin Breeding Services. Located in Elgin, Texas, Elgin Breeding Service is not only one of the best breeding services in the business, but also has superior customer service. Contact them at ebsbull@elginbreedingservices.com or by phone at 512-285-2019. Again, that's 512-285-2019. And visit their website at elginbreedingservice.com. Hello guys, thank you for listening to the Cattle Innovation Station podcast. We want to make this podcast better, so if you would, please like this episode and leave us feedback in the comment section. Something else that helps make this podcast better is when you respond to the polls. So if you're able, please respond to our polls. Help us make this podcast as good as possible. Thank you, God bless, and have a good day.
Thank you for listening to the Cattle Innovation Station podcast.
We hope you enjoyed the show.
We're your hosts, Baxter Whitworth
and Paul Hayes.
Remember our key verse, Proverbs 16:3.
Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and He will establish your plans.
Thank you for listening.